Hello, everyone. Welcome to eBizChat, where it is all, and I mean all, about business. So, I am Rick Zanotti, and I'm joined today by my co-host, and remember last week, she's magical. She is Dr. Susan Nash, and we went through a quick resume of hers just the other day, and she does a lot of things, so she is magical. Anyway, in studio, we've also got Harold Muliati, who is our video producer. And I actually had music, but for some odd reason, it's not cooperating right now. There we go. So there was some music, which is very low. We have our venerable economist back on, Dr. Ed Stuart, and there's still all sorts of stuff happening in the economy, so it should be interesting. What do you think, Susan?
I'm so glad that we're going to be able to continue because, as you were saying, this is an economist's dream. There's so many different factors.
And they all disagree. That's the beauty of it all. They all disagree. So here we go. This show is sponsored by Relate Corporation. Visit us at www.relatecasts.net. Thanks. And we are back, and in our center position of power, it is Dr. Ed Stuart. How you doing, Ed?
Rick, hi, Susan. I'm doing great. Sorry for the sneeze there, but there's all kinds of pollen in the air in Chicago these days. Spring is busting out all over, as they say.
Did you know that in Camarillo, where we are, it's considered the allergy center of the U.S.?
Oh.
It's one of the worst allergy places, and I never had allergies till we moved here, and I noticed that certain times it's either the sneezing or just congestion, and it's just we have a lot of pollen. Three-Way Valley, and it swirls right in there. Not fun. But anyway, well, last week we got onto a lot of topics, and let's start off this week with one of the current buzzwords. Everybody's talking about the housing boom and bust. So now the naysayers are going, it's going to fall. It's going to fall. We're there. We're all going to die. I don't know. I mean, the interest rates went down again last week, so that's spurring on a little more sales. There's still more demand than there is inventory. What do you think?
Well, I think every situation is different. And one of the things that gets economists and economic analysts in trouble is saying, oh, this is just like last whatever. And it's never just like last whatever. So I think your instincts are right, Rick. The housing boom these days really is a demand boom by people who want more housing. Whereas if you'll remember the 07, actually the 05, 06 boom, it was people not only buying a house to live in, but buying 3 or 4 others to speculate on price appreciation. And then when it turned out that there was a limit to how many people would buy 4 or 5 houses, then it crashed. I don't think there's that kind of demand. And also, I think that after the 07, 08, 09 financial crash, the Dodd-Frank regulations and the Fed itself got a little smarter about regulation and capital controls and capital balances. And I think most financial analysts these days agree that banks are in pretty good shape. So they're not as exposed to collateralized debt obligations or mortgage-backed securities or anything like that. There may be some speculation in individual stocks, but I think the real estate market is vigorous, and it will probably slow down. But what that means, I think, is that housing prices will stop going up as much as they're going up. I don't think they'll go down. They just won't go up as much as they have been going lately.
Well, some of the things
I'll jump in there and say that I agree for a couple of reasons. I think demand is causing prices to go up, but I also think there's some cost push with the
Right.
cost of the inputs. And I think
Yes.
that the inputs, the commodity prices will potentially go down, but not necessarily the manufactured goods. And that's because we're going to start seeing a kind of permanent increase in the price of energy.
Mm.
And that's due to changing to alternative energies because they just cost more. And like yesterday, Shell announced that they are being having to have the emission standards the same as the government of Netherlands. And then ExxonMobil removed or elected two new directors that are pro alternative energy and 2050 plan or 2030 plan. And same with Chevron. So while those are like a reduction of the supply of energy and an increase in the cost.
Well, let me ask you, taking that as a stepping stone, what about electric vehicles and stuff? Do you think that's going to make a difference in energy or at least gas consumption? Because electric is nice in some states, like California, because you've got tons of electrical outlets and you've got gas stations with electric and parking lots. Everybody's set for, your local Tesla. But not every state has that. If you go from state to state with an electric vehicle, you may run into some problems. What do you think that'll change? Are we heading more towards electric? Are we going to stick with gas? What's going on?
I think we're heading more towards electric, but like most of these kinds of big transitions, just think about the rollout of computers and how long that took and how kind of bumpy and clunky it was to get people used to using them and finding out new ways to use them. So I think it's 2021. I think maybe by 2031, and we may in the United States be 50% electric. But as you say, Rick, it's going to take a while to put charging stations in Montana and the Dakotas and so forth. And I think one of the big stories that's kind of flying under the radar is the legacy or the old American automobile companies and how heavily they're going into electric. I think General Motors is really the unsung story. Tesla gets all the headlines, but General Motors is really moving significantly into electric, and so are some of the major automobile companies in Europe, and Volvo is pledged to go all electric by 2030.
Really?
And I think that kind of demonstration effect. That's why I picked 2030 because Håkan Samuelsson, the CEO of Volvo, that's the pledge he made, is that Volvo would be all electric by 2030.
That's interesting. Now, the Chevy Volt was never a big hit. It sold some. It didn't do that well. That was kind of a flop. It didn't quite make it.
Right.
Didn't have. I think the biggest problem right now with electric is short mileage. You don't get a long. Most of them are 200 miles, 300 miles, and you're not even getting 400. Now, Tesla's working on new battery designs that they're saying could get you 1,000 miles. And we're still probably 5 years out, 2 to 5 years out.
Yeah.
Why doesn't anybody give Toyota and like Prius any credit? To me, they are amazing, but nobody talks about them. And that's
because they're not pure electric. That's why people like to bash them, because it's a fusion car. It's a hybrid, but it makes a lot of sense. I like the way they do that. I've driven Priuses. They were okay. They were sort of fun. I'm looking at like a Lexus, I think it's RX 350 or 450, I can't remember the number, which is kind of an SUV hybrid. And we drove one once because they loaned us once when our car was in the shop. It was fun. And it makes this really cool sound when you go backwards. It sounds like you're in a spaceship. It's like, ooh. And they do it on purpose so people can hear you. And she comes out, my wife comes out of the garage, I'm looking up going, there's a spaceship around here somewhere. And then I realized it's the car. That is the coolest thing. But they do drive quietly. They're pretty nice. They're effective. It's how often do you have to charge them, and how fast do you charge? I think you can charge them in several hours, maybe, but that's still hours. Versus you just plug it in, you're done, and you can't take the batteries out; they're too heavy, and there's too many of them. But there are things going on in the battery world that could make a difference in the future. We will see, I guess. Okay.
Yeah,
so
the other analogy I could think of is cell phones. You're old enough, Rick. Susan's not old enough to remember the first cell phones and how clunky they were and how little they did, right?
Yeah.
And how heavy they were to carry and how long it took to charge them.
Yeah.
I'm still amazed that the iPhone is really only 14 years old, right? We haven't had smartphones for that long. And you think of how integral they are now to everybody's life. And it was it took a bit, but once progress starts moving, it tends to move faster and faster. So the next few years of electric vehicles will be, fits and starts and clunky and so forth. But then as we get to 2030 and 2035, it'll start being much more normal and doable, right? Like you said, there'll be enough charging stations. There'll be better batteries. There'll be better mileage. And so it's, I think it's just a question of when, but it's going to be a kind of a rocky road to get there.
Now, getting back to housing, another reason that people aren't talking that much about, because it's not politically correct, I guess, but there's a large flight from the cities to the suburbs again. People feel not safe in the cities, and for obvious reasons. The police didn't do a very good job of stopping riots or anything else. And as a result, people say, I'm out of here. We see it in California. Los Angeles is about 50 miles from where I am. It is a lot of people trying to move to where we are in these areas. They just want out. And so, like, if you talk to real estate agents here, one of it is they want to buy more. Another thing is they just want out. They want a place where they feel is safer. And so that's another thing we're seeing that's driving that. And that goes down to, that's a government issue where the governments or the local governments or whatever aren't really doing a very good job of policing or anything else. So that's affecting the economy, especially in large cities. So I don't know.
Yeah, and that's really affecting prices in large cities.
Yeah.
It's a negative thing because fancy restaurants and boutiques that sell designer clothes, all the things that Susan wears, they're going to be hurting in big cities. But the plus side is that big cities will now be affordable to 20-somethings and newly starting out career folks who may need an apartment, or young entrepreneurs who need office and meeting space that suddenly, like you said, Rick, the vice president guy is moving to Austin or Reno or Palm Springs or something like that. But the 23-year-old geek who would like a bigger office and whatever, now in downtown Los Angeles or downtown Chicago, suddenly there are landlords who say, please come take my square footage because nobody else is.
Right.
Well, that's a good point. Like, okay, so to me, there are different types of downtowns. So there's a part of downtown that's gentrified and has become really nice, where it was kind of icky before. I mean, like in Washington, D.C., like DuPont Circle area, for example.
Right.
And so those, I don't think people are leaving from, but it's the ones where they're kind of moderate cost that are extremely expensive compared to what you would get in a smaller town. Those seem to be the things that people are leaving. And then even in places like Tulsa or Oklahoma City, office space downtown is just, I mean, they're just vacant buildings. And I'm sure it's the same in
Los
most
Angeles
cities.
is the same. Yep.
Wow. So I don't know, this office space, and you can't just turn office space into housing. So that's just going to be interesting. I don't know, vertical
Now, I
warehouses.
thought, now, Susan, I thought that's what
Yeah,
Bezos
you
was
can turn
investing
office
in.
space into housing, because actually you can buy a condo now in the Tribune Tower, where the iconic 1930s building of the
Okay.
Chicago Tribune. It's all
Interesting.
condos. The same thing in what was in the Wrigley building. Right, the Wrigley building is turning from offices into condos.
Mm-hmm.
So that's
I
another
guess if
thing
you
that's
get the
happening.
office cheap enough,
Pardon?
if you can buy the office building cheaply enough,
Yeah,
that could be a
yeah.
pretty good business
Well,
proposition.
and well, like we're talking about, a lot of office buildings are getting a lot cheaper.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of owners in bankruptcy, or they can't. Yeah, there's been a lot of defaults in office buildings and malls and other things.
Well, and you think of something like the Chicago Tribune, which used to have thousands and thousands of journalists in one building. Now the journalists are sitting in front of a computer screen, and there aren't that many of them, and so the Tribune doesn't need the building at all. And that's happening in a lot of industries that used to depend on the agglomeration of thousands and thousands of people that don't need that anymore. So that's why I say the center of a city is going to turn younger and poorer. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, especially if you're young and poor, right?
Well, I think the thing is that you'll still have the pockets of the gentrified part that'll be for the rich, because, and especially places like New York, people have used real estate there as a hedge against inflation or stability, hedge against their own currencies.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There's still Chinese money, Venezuelan money, and American real estate, and you're right. It'll always be there.
By the way, China just bought Hellmann's mayonnaise.
Oh my gosh!
It was an interesting acquisition. I'm not quite sure why, but they bought Hellmann's. So my mom had the best line of all. She goes, "The Chinese bought Hellmann's. I'm sticking with best then. Best is Hellmann's." I didn't want to break her bubble, so I go, "That's a good idea, Mom. Sure."
Yeah. Right. Go ahead. Yeah.
I guess they'd like to make a lot of ham sandwiches because they own all the pork now, pork processing.
That was interesting. It's interesting.
Ham salad.
If you want to talk about messed up economies, Argentina now is rationing meat to the internal population because over 150 meat packing plants have closed down because the idiots running the country basically aren't exporting meat anymore for whatever reason.
What?
Yeah, they're losing $10 billion a month on that. It's like, what are they doing? And the people, there's going to be a revolution there pretty soon. People are so angry. So I don't know what's going to happen there, but it's interesting. This is one of the richest meat countries in the world, and now they don't even have meat for themselves. Interesting.
Wow.
One of my former students at Illinois State University, Ricardo Pereira, from Bolivia, said that Argentine steak was the best in the world. He was an upper class Bolivian and had traveled all over the world, and he said, "You have not eaten good steak until you've eaten Argentinian steak."
It's all free range, and it tastes good. Yeah, it does, and it's cheap.
Yeah.
And what we pay, filet mignon here would be probably $35 a pound or something like that, 25 to 35, and over there it's probably 5, maybe 2.
Yep,
it's cheap.
Wow.
Great example of the hectorolene factor price.
Oh, Ed, you're cut out.
Theory.
Oh, we didn't hear that. You cut out.
It's the hectorolene factor price foreign trade theory about why countries with certain kinds of resources export some kind of goods and not others. Yeah. And if you've got lots of land like Argentina does, then you export things that use land, like beef and now wine, Malbec. Yeah.
Well, Malbec's famous over there in Mendoza.
Yeah.
But they said that they said that the government estimated there were 3 million cows in Argentina. and the meatpacking industry said, "You idiots, we have 54 million cows in Argentina." They don't have a clue what they have. 54 million cows. That's a lot of cows. That's a lot of cows. And And that's constantly being replenished for meat production and everything else. Though I think Argentina and Australia are probably two of the biggest beef exporters in the world.
Right.
And Brazil.
And Brazil too.
big,
Yeah.
Mhm.
Though I've had the Brazilian meat. Not as good. It just doesn't taste as good. At least in the restaurants I've been to, Argentine, Brazilian restaurants, wasn't that impressed.
So right now we're still in supply chain issues, with like Brazil, et cetera, can't export because they have, they just have, they're still having a surge, and then India is having issues. But what happens, and what do you think is going to happen as country by country starts to finally recover from COVID?
Then what we've been talking about, that the stock market isn't terribly overvalued, that real estate isn't terribly overvalued, that employment will come back, and I think I said in 2 or 3 shows ago that Europe would come back. It would come back after the United States, and it's coming back now, little by little. And yeah, I think we're in for 2 or 3 more years of really solid economic growth.
I think so too. I think that we're going to have an energy crunch, though, and so there's going to have to be a lot of investment in infrastructure, mainly like electrical transmission, et cetera. In fact, I was looking into what it would be like to have boutique solar farms. Here's what I thought. Next to like a transmission station or basically a power station, have where nobody wants to build, and then where you have these cross-country electrical lines, why not put solar panels along there and then ring the power stations? I mean, I know that people prefer to have like huge solar farms for economies of scale, but it just seems to me that sometimes the need is more local. And so I'm kind of interested in exploring that.
Well, Susan, keep your eye on nanotech, because one thing that's going to be happening, it hasn't happened yet, at least not large scale, it's probably very small, but there are paints being developed with nanoparticles. The nanoparticles will actually act like solar cells and generate power for the houses. So you paint a house with this paint, and now you basically have the whole house is an energy generator. Now that's happening. The prototypes were there about 10, 12 years ago already. Haven't seen much of it or heard much about it recently, but they're there. That's technology that will eventually one day appear. And that would be very different too, because now paint can now transmit power through nanoparticles or carbon nanotubes, basically. It'll be pretty fascinating when they do that.
Susan, I heard a speech about 10 years ago at the Goethe Institute here in Chicago by one of the leading Green Party politicians in Germany. And one of the Green Party platforms back then was to have the German government subsidize every household to put solar panels in their backyard or on their roof. And it didn't win, and it didn't pass because the Germans are kind of congenitally stingy about spending money on themselves. It would be rational. But yeah, I think that's an idea whose time will come sometime. And yeah, there's no reason why every structure in the country can't have some kind of solar collection for heat, for power, for all of those things.
And excess would go back to the grid.
Yeah, exactly. All right.
Well, and the other thing too.
Go ahead, Susan.
That's another thing. Okay, go ahead, Susan.
Oh, well, okay. But I was just saying the other thing that we're going to be into is water. I was in a workshop yesterday where we're talking about just looking at water resources, groundwater, any kind of potable water. And the same principle applies to what you were talking about. We're going to have to do more basically conservation, but but purification on a local level or individual level, actual water purification.
That's interesting.
That's true. Well, I was going to say, Rick, that this, micro energy collection necessitates more investment in research in battery and storage, because maybe you don't want to send it all back to the grid. Maybe you want to keep it, in reserve for your own individual or household use.
Yeah,
as well.
So the key is: are we going to become? So are we going to become Dune in the next 10 years? Sometimes it feels like we're heading there.
I'm optimistic. Interesting things in the coming years.
Yeah, I hope so. I think we have some variables that I find disturbing, and that's mostly governments around the world, especially ours and others, which get in the way of a lot of stuff, whether good or bad or indifferent. They always seem to be in the way, not necessarily paving the way, but just in the way. That's what I call one of the variables I don't like. It's just it is what it is. But there's a lot of governments. I don't know. I don't know where we're going to wind up in terms of what ism we're all going to wind up in, whether it's going to be a socialism, a communism, a capitalism, or just some weird combination of all three of those. But I do find the isms a little scary right now because they're unpredictable. I think that's the biggest thing. I find a little bit of unpredictableness in areas that everybody would prefer to be a little more predictable. What do you think?
I'm worried also about people wanting fast solutions but then they have unintended consequences. For example, what are some of the solutions for homelessness? Some of the easy, quick solutions may not actually work out so well. Like, okay, well, what would be an easy, quick solution? Rounding them all up and giving them, quote, jobs and letting them work and
the one thing, Susan, the one big problem with a lot of the homeless people that nobody wants to talk about again is a large percentage are mentally ill. So the real question is, how do you treat mentally ill people who don't want to be treated, who don't want to be treated, and yet, I don't want meds. Well, yeah, but look at the condition they're in. And there's a lot of issues. And it's not that they ruin their own lives, they ruin the lives of a lot of people around them. So I don't know. It's a tough one. In LA, we've got tons.
Yeah, and this is the long run consequence of Vietnam and then Afghanistan and Iraq. Yep. That yes, we're all gung ho. Thank you for your service, but we're not going to pay money to help you deal with all of the, the issues,
the horrors of war. Yeah,
the horrors of war, and especially these kinds of wars, where unlike the good old days when my dad was fighting the evil Nazis or the evil Imperial Japanese, these wars you're not going to win.
No,
there is, what is the enemy in Iraq or Afghanistan? There are 40 or 50 enemy, and sometimes the enemy turns out to be later they're on our side, and then they switch sides, and you're asking 20-year-old boys and girls now to do things that are impossible. Then they come home and they're just like, okay, go away. We're gonna salute the flag, and we're gonna have flyovers, and we're gonna have the national anthem, and that takes care of everything. And it doesn't take care of anything.
What happened in Russia? They've been in enough wars and stuff. What happens to their people who come back? Do they have any kind of treatment?
No, they do what Susan does. They lock them up and put them away.
Okay.
And this is my idea.
And one of the really important things that Gorbachev did was get the Russians out of Afghanistan, because that was ruining the Russian army. Now you'll notice that one of the relatively clever things that Putin does, he's always sending the Russian army places, but they're never there to fight. They're there to march and to look tough, and then they go back to Moscow. But they never go anywhere to fight.
No.
So they don't have the post-traumatic stress disorder problems that our people have out of Iraq and Afghanistan. But the Russians deal with chronic alcoholism
Right.
and
Yeah. Other issues. Yep.
yeah, and their treatments are relatively harsh and brutal.
But
Right.
believe it or not, we're out of time again. These things go so fast. Too
I was
fast.
about to go have a drink, but now that I've talked about that, I think I won't. I think I'll just have some mineral water and
Stick to that honey and tea.
yeah, exactly. Good advice, Rick.
Good stuff.
But it is true that and unfortunately, I mean, just having people rounding them up and having them work in gardens and stuff won't help when they're self-medicating, and then they become unwitting important consumers in the underground economy.
Yep, that's true. It's going to be interesting. Well, we haven't yet fixed all the world's problems, but Dr. Ed, we'll have to have you on again soon.
Enjoyed it, Rick.
Always do. We love it. Susan, as always. Hey, and by the way, you guys have a wonderful Memorial Day weekend. I hope you guys get to go out and have some good fresh air and try to enjoy it. Like I said, have some good meals.
Thank you.
So we'll see
you.
And we'll see everyone next week on eBizChat. Have a good one, everyone. Thanks. Thanks, Ed. Thanks, Susan.
You're welcome. My pleasure.